and jump in and get started. That way we can make sure we get wrapped up on time. Again, as we get started, we'd love to see your faces if you're able to join us that way today. But we understand sometimes you just can't, and that's okay. But with that, let's kick it off for our first of several this year. Deeper learning sessions that are curriculum specific. So we're a smaller group. This is just our Amplify folks. So hopefully if you've joined, that's what you teach. If not, we had my perspectives yesterday and we have guidebooks tomorrow. But today's session is for our Amplify folks. So I've dropped in the chat and I'll do it again right now. The link to our website, which has our materials, and you'll need the participant packet for today. But let's kick it off. Jetta, anything you want to add as we get started?
Yeah, I would just say I'm excited for this to be, a recurring learning community within our Strong Start network of our curriculum.
Hi, how are you?
And an opportunity for everyone to collaborate specifically around your materials. And I'm excited to jump in with you all today.
All righty, so you've seen this slide before, but it never hurts to just kind of recap, right? We've done a lot so far as a network last semester, but you'll see where that bright pink star is. As we jump into this school year, we're really zeroing in, right? Looking at curriculum implementation, very specific aspects of that. Today being vocabulary instruction, and we'll continue to explore student work and the impact our instruction is having on student learning throughout the year. All right, so to kick us off here, just a reminder from last time, as a network, we've set some goals, and I'll do a little shout out about that. Thank you all so much for submitting your team and personal goals. I think I just still have a few folks that I'm circling back to get those personal goals. Remember, we're measuring progress. You can't improve what you can't measure. So we're trying to get real specific about how we'll know we're making an improvement around our goals, and we'll look at some ways to do that. And then we're taking action, right? Part of our work as a network is to learn some things, go try them out in our classrooms, reflect a bit personally, also with our colleagues, and share our learning with each other. So this is part of our model for improvement, and you'll see some of these little symbols throughout our time today. And then similarly, we want to revisit our dispositions. So get your typers ready, and we're going to jump to the chat real quick to get us started. Or of course you can share on the mic. Thinking about our improvement dispositions, right? These are kind of like our mindsets. It's our way of engaging in this work in our classrooms and thinking about personal and professional growth. Which one or ones have been, the most prominent or dominant as you kicked off this school year? So has it been open-minded, or about being disciplined, responsive to evidence, being self-reflective, action-oriented, collaborative, or systems focused? So in the chat, which one or ones have been the most prominent for you and why as you kicked off the school year? And as they start to kind of pop in, scroll through there and see what some of your colleagues are saying. All right, so we're sharing in the chat some of our Strong Start Network dispositions that have been most prominent to kick us off this school year. I see some open-minded, especially when we're thinking about starting something new. That's always helpful. Discipline, trying to integrate all parts of the curriculum with some fidelity. Thanks for sharing that, Alicia. Let's see, Ellie says she's been very action-oriented. I know all of us have been action-oriented, but Ellie says that in these first few weeks of school, it's really tied to being also evidence. See some other folks being self-reflective. Ooh, and thinking about students' writing and their ability, and maybe some baseline information that you're gathering about students, especially coming out of last year. Yeah, how can we use that kind of evidence to guide our work? Yeah, collaborative. Thanks, Jill, for calling that one out. Right, maybe working with our colleagues as we try to unpack this new curriculum in the second year of implementation. Jetta, anything you're noticing that I've not called out?
No, I think it's just nice that people are thinking both about like what this looks like in terms of their like classroom practice with your students, but also the way you're using these dispositions to collaborate with one another and colleagues. I see that as like a trend here that's nice to see.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you for sharing those. And also just want to say thank you for sharing your goals. So it was really exciting as both our kind of identify just a team lead per se for each group, and you all shared kind of a team goal, which we talked a little bit about last time when we met in August, and you collaborated a bit to work to articulate that, but then also your personal Strong Start Network goals. And these goals will be used to inform kind of the design and development of these sessions. And so Jed and I will look at those and think about how we can make sure we're meeting your needs as set by your team and individual goals. And we'll also assess progress toward and revisit these goals throughout the year, as well as share progress with each other around what improvements we're seeing as related to our goals. And it was neat to see as we kind of looked across the goals, some trends, both in team goals and in your individual goals. Lots of folks called out writing as a focus area, as well as student conversations. Vocabulary came up, so that was quite fitting for today's session. Maintaining rigor, right? How do we keep the rigor that's really intended in the design of our materials while also scaffolding and supporting to meet our students' needs? Creating and scaffolding, again, a greater student independence, whether it be in the reading process or writing process, speaking process, and really then the use of effective text evidence came out also as a trend across your personal goals and in our team goals. So we look forward to circling back to these a few times throughout the year, of course. All right, Jetta, we're jumping into an activity straight out the gate, aren't we?
Okay, yeah. So we are going to be talking about vocabulary today and what effective vocabulary instruction in our literacy materials looks like. And so I want to start off with a quick vocabulary team builder. So we are going to send you to breakout rooms, and this is going to be a bit of a speed test here. I'm giving you some challenging academic vocabulary. Don't worry, you're not supposed to off the cuff know all of these words. But you and your group are going to try and create a story using as many of these vocabulary words as possible. And you should feel free to Google the meaning of them. Don't be bashful about that. Bethany just put into the chat a Google Doc. So there'll be space for each breakout room to write your story in the Google Doc. And these vocabulary words are at the top of the Google Docs. You'll be able to see them from your breakout room. Any questions before we go? Okay, you guys will have.
Real quick.
Oh, go
it's
ahead.
Not a question, but it is. I want you to notice that little light bulb in the bottom left-hand corner. This is a wonderful opportunity for us to kind of engage in those improvement dispositions, right? Being open-minded about this experience, but also remembering this is a wonderful way to build empathy for our students, right? That's the point of this activity. So we'll let you jump in and start story writing.
Great. So you have only 5 minutes. Got to do it quickly. We are going to send you to breakout rooms, and we'll see you back here in a few.
Oh.
I'm sorry. Am my mic still on? I'm
Sorry.
sorry. I'm not really good with Zoom yet.
Well, that's all right. We'll figure it out together.
So it looks like you guys have some creative stories just in that short window of time. I would love to hear from a few people what that felt like. What was your experience of doing that?
Okay, I want to cry and I need a do-over. So
why do you want to cry?
I couldn't Google words fast enough. And when some of my team were like, I'm in the car driving, can you read those words to me? I'm like, no, I can't even pronounce those words. Are you kidding me? So yeah, there was a little bit of frustration right there. So I'm Googling, just trying to pronounce the stinking word, you know.
To full transparency, I had to Google a pronunciation for inchoate.
That's the one I had to Google. Yes, thank you. Thanks so
I've been
much.
using
Jenna.
it quite a bit since I have been doing this session with folks, but it's a tricky one.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I feel your frustration, Leanne, because creative writing, I have never felt like is my strong point. And so there's 5 minutes and I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to come up with something. And then you start to see other people typing on the forum and that makes me panic too.
Okay, great. I wanted us to start off with this activity because I think, to Bethany's point about reminding us of putting ourselves in our student shoes here, this is in some ways an empathy experience for you all, that we often put our students in this exact same position with vocabulary, right? We like introduce a word to them and we're like, okay, go write with it. You have this much time. And they can see, to your point, like they can see classmates doing the work right next to them, like their stress levels go up. They're not really sure if they're using it right. Do they know how to pronounce it? Do they feel comfortable with it, right? And so I wanted to start with this to remind us both that, vocabulary can be really intimidating, even as, very well-educated, informed adults, but especially for our middle school students. And especially when we throw them into that. And so today's session is really about what are our best practices for vocabulary instruction so that students don't feel like that. They don't feel panicked and stressed by this, right? But they have lots of opportunity to be exposed and learn vocabulary so they can use it comfortably and not, furiously Googling it as they're trying to complete their writing tests for class. So keep that in mind as we jump into today's session. So our objectives for today's session are to, one, understand the role of vocabulary instruction in knowledge building and building fluent skilled reading, identify which vocabulary is highest leverage for and most in need of instruction for supporting students, and then identify and apply best practices for vocabulary instruction in our own instructional materials, so within Amplify. We're going to kind of go through 3 sections for this session today. First, we're going to talk about the why of vocabulary instruction. Why do we even teach vocabulary? What's the role of vocabulary instruction in building knowledge and skilled fluent readers? And then what vocabulary do we teach, right? What vocabulary should be called out for explicit instruction and why is that the vocabulary that's selected for us to spend instructional time on? And then lastly is the how, right? What are our best practices for vocabulary instruction and what does that look like in our instructional materials? Okay, so we are going to start. I want to talk about this why question first. And I want to start by showing you all, this is a 4-part processing model of reading. This is from reading researcher Marilyn Adams. And this is one of the, sort of canonical examples of what the reading process looks like in the brain. And I'm just going to orient, this is like a speed course in Marilyn Adams' processing model. But as I'm describing this, I want you to be thinking about where do we see vocabulary showing up in this processing model, right? So think about each of these processes happening in our brain as we read and think about where vocabulary might be showing up. So these bottom 2 boxes here that you see, the orthographic processor and the phonological processor. Phonological processor is how we take in speech, right? How we take in the sounds of language. And we actually do this when we hear language, like when we're listening to a story or we're listening to someone speak, but we actually use our phonological processor when we're reading print text as well, right? For any of you who've studied early foundational skills literacy, we all actually process the sounds of words as we read them, even if we're reading them silently in our heads. And then the orthographic processor here is print, right? It's how do we read the words on a page and take them in and recognize what those words are to fluently read them. The meaning processor in the middle there is really where we're making meaning of the text, right? We're taking those words that we read and interpreting their meaning to understand the meaning of the text. That green box above it is the context processor, right? It's everything that I, Jetta, bring to the text that I'm reading. It's my background knowledge, it's my personal experiences, it's what I know about this author, it's what I know about this text, right? That help inform me making meaning of the text itself. So my question for you all, and would love to hear some thoughts in the chat box here, so I'll give everybody a minute to think about this, is where do you think vocabulary shows up in this processing model? If you're thinking about each of these things as different processes that are going on in our brain as we are reading a text, where do you think vocabulary might impact one of these processes? Oh, I love what Alicia says, all of them. I think that's probably right, Alicia. Debbie says mostly context. Okay, great. So yes, I agree. I think in all of them, let me highlight a few of those ways. So the first is vocabulary helps us, as you guys point out, make this connection between context and meaning, right? When we have, I bring to the text that I'm reading context on different vocabulary and a knowledge base around them that helps inform my meaning of the text. I think that's one of the clearest ways. One thing to think about is the way that when we don't know vocabulary in a text, when we have unfamiliar words, when I run across the word inchoate in a text and I don't know what it means, I have to rely on the additional context I have or additional meaning in the text to help bootstrap my understanding of the text, right? If I can't figure out what inchoate means, I've got to use other resources to help me interpret the meaning. And so while I can do that as a reader, it's a hurdle to overcome, right? And it slows down my process. One other piece to consider here, to the point you all raised that vocabulary really influences all of these, is that knowing vocabulary really supports fluency and orthographic mapping, right? Orthographic mapping is just the ability to have words in our long-term memory, so we can see that word and recognize it automatically and fluently. And so the more vocabulary we know, the more words we have committed to that long-term mapping, and it speeds up orthographic mapping. So all that is to say that knowing vocabulary is really essential to reading, right? And building students' strong vocabulary helps them become not only more knowledgeable with a wider breadth of vocabulary, but also more fluent automatic readers as well. And one of the reasons for this is because of our semantic networks. So a semantic network is really just the implicit activation, meaning it happens pretty invisibly to us, but quite automatically in our brains as we read or talk or engage about a topic, of the different related ideas and vocabulary that we have while reading or listening to a text. So this visual here is an example of it, right? That with the vocabulary word mammal, I might have all of these different connections that my brain is making quite implicitly behind the scenes as I'm reading about mammals, right? I can think about some of their characteristics as vertebrae. I can think about, some examples like a cat. I can think about, they're a category of animal, which is also a fish, right? And so I can think about the relationships of mammals to other animals in the animal kingdom, right? And I do all of that without having to make those explicit connections. Students that have a wider breadth of knowledge and vocabulary build wider and stronger semantic networks of information that they can draw upon while they're reading and listening to a text. And so if we think back to this, our 4-part processing model, think about that context processor getting stronger and bigger, right? So that when I go to my meaning processor, I have even more information to draw upon for my meaning processor. So again, just sort of highlights here that building vocabulary makes you a stronger reader. So I want us to stop and reflect for a second, and you can use, some of the information that we just talked about in the past few slides, but also your own personal experience or knowledge of vocabulary instruction for students. Why do you think vocabulary instruction is important for our middle school students? And how does it impact their development as readers or as students in general? We have a Padlet that a Jamboard, Google Jamboard, similar to a Padlet. I'm going to ask you guys to post your reflections to these questions on. Bethany's going to put that in the chat box for us. And when you go to the Jamboard, remember that the way that you post messages is you go to the little post-it note icon in the menu bar, and you can add post-it notes to post your thoughts to the Jamboard. So I'll give everybody just about 2 minutes here to post a reflection to that question, and then we will come back and discuss. So I see lots of connections here to the relationship between vocabulary and writing, which I didn't talk about as much here in my opening slides. I talked more about the connection between vocabulary and reading. So I appreciate you guys calling that out. Okay, great. I wanted to, I think we should ground ourselves in this, what the value of vocabulary instruction for our students, because I think often, we can start our lessons and there's like a vocabulary lesson we're supposed to do, and we're just like kind of going through the motions of it. But I think reminding ourselves that those pieces, even when they're just, short 5 or 10 minute parts of our lesson, are really crucial foundational pieces for students growing as readers and writers. Is important to hold on to, right? That is really crucial work, even when it happens in very small doses. So keep that in mind as we dig into the next part of our session, which is really around the what. So what is called out for in explicitly teaching vocabulary instruction. So we looked at this slide back in our summer retreat, but I wanted to remind us of it. Partially because I think it's very powerful, but also connects us back to some of the content we did during our July retreat. So remember that knowledge and vocabulary are really two sides of the same coin, right? As students develop a broader background knowledge, they learn more specific vocabulary to the topics they're building knowledge around, right? And as students build more vocabulary, they're able to match those to the different topics they're building knowledge around, right? It is also important to note that through building knowledge through text, students learn more vocabulary, right? This is a really powerful data point from a famous study here that I think really emphasizes the importance of learning vocabulary through text. So reading or listening to a series of text on the same topic can yield as much as 4 times the vocabulary growth as, say, direct instruction of different vocabulary words, right? And also when we think about the great breadth of vocabulary that students need to know to become, literate, prepared for college readers, there's no way we can individually teach each of those words, right? Students are going to have to learn those through text. And so that's why the way our instructional materials are set up to teach vocabulary through text is so crucial. And these visuals are just here to remind us of this idea that when we learn, the stronger the schema is, the stronger that semantic network that we have around vocabulary, the more likely we are to recall vocabulary. It makes it sticky. It gives it something to attach to. And one example of this is the knowledge building reading we did this summer. I'm curious if anybody can recall a vocabulary that term that we used in our shrimp text back in July. And if you can, you could type in the chat box. Is there any vocabulary you remember from that text? You don't have to spell it correctly.
Good. That's what I was going to ask.
Spelling correctly not required. All right. Ellie, Alicia, Bethany, beautiful. Yes. So Anastraka was the scientific name for the fairy shrimp that we read about. And we read about the ephemeral ponds that were their habitats that were causing their extinction. So beautiful. So that's a really good example. Those are words. There's no reason that Alicia should remember the term Anastraka, right? But we spent time building knowledge around that word, right? And you developed but you built a schema around that term. And so now a few months later, when I bring it up out of the blue, you're able to recall that vocabulary, right? And so it's just an example of that importance of not just learning the vocabulary, but learning the vocabulary around a body of knowledge and around a text with it as well. We looked at this slide this summer too, but I wanted to think about it. We're going to talk about like what vocabulary we teach in just a moment. And so I want to remind us of the different types of vocabulary that students engage with in our classrooms and in text that they read. So the first is our tier 1 vocabulary. That's our everyday speech, right? That we use in conversation with one another. Tier 2 vocabulary is our general academic language, right? That we could find across disciplines. And then lastly is our domain specific language, like Anastraka, that we're just going to find in our specific content areas or specific content we're teaching. So when we think about what vocabulary we should teach, what vocabulary we should spend more time on, and what vocabulary we should spend less instructional time on, this is just a quick cheat sheet of how we think about that. And it's really also a cheat sheet for how our instructional materials are designed and how our curriculum designers think about which vocabulary to call attention to, like within Amplify. So words that require or merit more time and attention are words that are more abstract, words that have multiple interrelated meanings or nuances, meanings or shades of meanings that are not likely part of students' experiences, right? That's something beyond their day-to-day experiences or lived experiences for them. Words that require or merit relatively less attention are words that are more concrete or have single meanings that can be quickly or easily communicated, meanings or shades of meanings that are part of student experiences. I actually think ephemeral is a really good example from the fairy shrimp text as being a word that's pretty abstract and has multiple meanings, right? In that case, we were using it in this like scientific way to talk about this specific type of pond that only occurs for short periods of time, right? But ephemeral is often used in a much more poetic, abstract way for things that only exist for short periods of time. And so spending some time on the meaning of that word would make a lot of sense in reading those texts. And we actually did that in our, when we tried that, those texts out together as a group. And it's a word that we can expect students will encounter in the future in academic texts, right? So another way of thinking about this is, how do our high quality instructional materials identify words for vocabulary instruction? So how does Amplify pick which words that we're going to teach beyond just that sort of abstract versus concrete or nuances of meaning? So thinking about, is the word essential to understanding the text? Again, like ephemeral was for you to understand the crucialness of those types of ponds to the Anastraca's habitat. You needed to know what ephemeral meant. So that was crucial to the understanding of the text. It's likely to appear in a wide range of academic texts, like they're going to experience it beyond this one particular text they're reading, or it's part of a semantic word family, right? And knowing that word will help them unpack and understand other words. So we're going to try out this idea a little bit of identifying which words we should spend more time on instructionally and which times we should spend less time on instructionally. And part of why I want to do this, Amplify does this for us, right? They both in your instructional materials and saying where you should spend some instructional time, but also in where they, give definitions or give call out boxes for students to identify words. They have done that work, but you all are, we used this term last year when we were talking about our instructional materials, you all are critical consumers of your instructional materials, meaning you have to take them and apply them to your students, understanding your students' needs and knowledge. And there's no way that any curriculum designer can know the needs of all students across the country. And so knowing where to spend more time or where to spend less time on your particular students is really crucial. So I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about how do we make those decisions about where we spend more or less time on vocabulary. So we're going to do this using this quadrant. So let me talk through it a little bit, and then you guys are going to try it out, and hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense as you test it out for yourselves. So think about quadrant 1, so this first box here, as words that require less time to learn. So they're a little bit easier to learn because they're in that, they follow that concrete example, or they describe an object or a process that might be familiar to students' experiences. And then within the text, students can probably figure out the meaning of the word from context in the text. So that quadrant 1 is the easiest words, right? They're concrete, they're familiar to students, and they could probably figure out the meaning from the text. Quadrant 2 is they could still figure out the meaning from the text, but they might require a little bit more time to learn, meaning they're abstract or they have multiple meanings, etc. Coming down here to quadrant 3, box 3, is the meaning needs to be provided because you can't really figure it out from the text itself, but it's still a concrete word that describes something that might be familiar to student. Quadrant 4 is going to be your most challenging and going to require the most time because the students can't figure out the meaning from the text. You've got to provide the meaning to them in some way. And it is an abstract word or has multiple meanings, etc. So I think that's all a little bit confusing, but the best way to do this is to actually try it out. So in your handouts for today's session, which I think put the chat at the beginning of the session today, there's this short passage, which saying "Thanks to My Ghost" by Amy Tan. I have highlighted some words in blue. So medium, gust, agony, Ouija board, ghostwriters, plentifully. I want you to read the passage and I want you to try and put those different words in one of the quadrants based on those criteria. I'm going to give everybody about 3 minutes to do that. Just try it out, get through as many words as you can, and then we'll come back and debrief it a little bit. Questions? Okay, give it a try. Okay, let's come back together. And I know that you probably didn't get through all of that, but got to hopefully try out a few of the words. And I would love to just hear folks' reflections on what was that like? What do you think? Was that challenging? Totally easy? What's valuable about doing something like that and thinking about vocabulary for your own students? If anyone wants to unmute themselves and share, that would be great. I'd love to hear voices besides my own.
I think that it's definitely helpful in knowing which ones I have to teach explicitly and spend, maybe do a Freyer model or something with it. And then as well as ones that going back and forth between everything, the one that says meaning needs to be provided, but it doesn't really require a lot of time. So like Ouija board and opium, I think you could give a quick, a definition there for those. And then they would probably remember and that would be enough. So you wouldn't have to spend a lot of time. But when you get to like medium, stricken, maybe stemmed, you're going to have to spend a little more time because, I think gust of wind is obviously contextual. They could figure it out. Ghostwriters would be an interesting one to teach. So I'm not sure exactly where it would fit.
I love that, Alicia. Anyone want to add on? I don't think this is like an exact science, right? Like there's judgment calls here. And, as I said, you all know your students best. And so our instructional materials do a lot of this for us in identifying that vocabulary. But one of the reasons I think it's helpful to go through this process is because you still have to be judicious about like, no, that's a word my students are actually going to need to spend more time on because they don't have a lot of background around that. Or no, they've got that word. I'm actually not going to spend a lot of time on that, right? I also think the way you frame that, Alicia, we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we get into how we teach this vocabulary, about what is the balance in how much time we should spend on a word and what that looks like in our practice. I'll show you guys where I put these words in my quadrant. I think your point, Alicia, about ghostwriters is a good one. That is a word that actually has a lot of meaning to that text, right? And she's kind of using it in a way that has like a double entendre a bit to it, right? So that could be an interesting word to spend time on just to get to the central idea of the text. I put agony in my like fourth quadrant here just because I think it's one that is a more abstract concept. It'll definitely appear in future text. And to that other criteria, understanding its meaning to that passage really helps unlock the meaning of the passage for the students themselves. Okay, great. So let's move on to how, and thinking about how do our instructional materials set us up for best practices for vocabulary instruction. So these criteria, these are pillars from Becca McEwen, researchers who have the seminal text on what strong vocabulary instruction should look like. And their basic pillars here are: when we teach vocabulary, we should introduce words in context, right? Rather than giving a vocabulary word separate, isolated from text, it should always come with repeated exposure to vocabulary in text themselves. We should provide several opportunities for students to engage with the words, right? Students should see them repeatedly in different texts that they're reading, hearing, speaking, writing. And then lastly, students should be asked to engage in production of using this vocabulary in their writing and speaking. And our instructional materials, Amplify does this so well, gives both opportunities, multiple opportunities for students to be exposed to the vocabulary word, to practice it, to use it in writing, etc. So I think this gets to Alicia's point that she was raising there of thinking about, what are words that I can just give a quick definition to and move on? And what are words that I should be spending more time on, maybe doing some examples and non-examples, right? And so our first step is sort of identifying where different vocabulary words fit in that quadrant, and then figuring out what are my instructional strategies for doing that. And again, our instructional materials, Amplify does this really well, but you knowing where if I know that there's a word that my students are going to need additional support on, where should I spend more time or less time? So a light touch approach to vocabulary instruction for those words that we, like a Ouija board, for example, where we can just give a quick definition and move on. This is where we're giving, quick student-friendly definitions. This is just like a quick, I'm going to tell you the definition so it doesn't hold you back in your reading, but we're not going to spend any time discussing the word, right? I might give a visual key definitions. And again, Amplify does this for a lot of the text to give students that scaffold. Quick call out definition boxes, giving students a quick illustration or image. Again, I think Ouija board, that's like a quick, you could show kids the image and they'd be like, oh yeah, I know what that is, right? Or a quick example to keep in mind as they are reading a text. Vocabulary instruction that has a heavier touch, right? So we're spending more time, we're studying it in context, it's more time intensive. We might generate examples or non-examples. We're going to ask students to use it in conversation. We're going to ask students to use it in writing. We might study the word family if that's appropriate for the word itself. One other connection I want to make here is to our instructional practice guide that really sets out our vision for what we want literacy instruction to look like and sound like in our classrooms. And vocabulary really lives in core action 2 in our instructional practice guide. And I just wanted to name that in core action 2 indicator C. The indicator there is that in our strong lessons, we have questions and a task that attend to the words or academic vocabulary, phrases, and sentences within the text. And I wanted to highlight that because the instructional practice guide is naming that vocabulary should serve students' understanding of the text. We should be studying vocabulary so that it deepens students' understanding of the text that they're reading. And then lastly, we also in indicator D, questions and tasks are sequenced to build knowledge by guiding students to delve deeper into the text and graphics, right? And so I think that's also, there's vocabulary embedded there as well, right? Just in the sense that we're using those questions and tasks to build students' knowledge and to build their vocabulary. Okay, so we're going to spend some time now digging into our materials. We're going to go into breakout rooms, and we asked you all to come with a lesson that for today's session. It could be any lesson, but I want you to think about, as you look in that lesson, where do you notice vocabulary supports for your students? What does instructional strategies in Amplify look like? How do you explicitly teach vocabulary in Amplify? How can vocabulary instruction build knowledge or deeper understanding of the text in your lesson? Is there lighter touch or heavier touch? What do you notice about vocabulary instruction in your materials there? Where might your students struggle? Where have you seen them struggling with vocabulary in your materials? And how can you support students through that? So we're going to send you to breakout rooms, and you guys will have 10 minutes to talk and discuss, and then we will come back as a whole group. We're also going to do a leader-specific breakout group. So for leaders, your questions here are, what are the most common practices you see across classrooms for vocabulary instructions? Are there any trends you see in core action 2? And how can you support your students and teachers with vocabulary instruction? Okay.
And Jetta, these questions are in their packet as well.
Beautiful, thank you. They're in the handouts so you guys can reference them from your breakout rooms.
Although I don't know if the leader ones are. So if you're a leader, you might want to take a quick picture.
Okay, welcome back. I would love to just hear, we were having such a great conversation in my room. I would love to hear from a few takeaways from each room.
A little louder. No, just kidding.
I know.
I'm teasing.
We sort of talked about how there's so much vocabulary and how you have to kind of prioritize what is most necessary that comes out instructionally within the lesson, but then also like just in context with our students. Like we got into a whole conversation about like the way Amplify instructs vocabulary. So we may have like bunny trailed a little bit, but I think it was still a good talk. Just talking about how like the words to use and like the word wall words sometimes differ from like the focus of the lesson, and how we have to sort of choose as teachers what is most necessary for our students, but also what like the core objective is of the lesson and how that ties to the vocabulary we should choose. I feel like that was kind of circular, but like, you know, that was our takeaway.
Another group? Thank you, Ellie.
We kind of agreed that in this first unit that we're doing in Amplify, most of our vocabulary seems to be academic vocabulary, just like learning like, you know, perspective and dialogue, more so because we are working in narrative units, more so than like, you know, tier 2s or 1s or whatever.
Yeah, I was really happy to hear in my group just that we were having this good conversation about like, there's so many words and I don't know what's important, you know, and hoping to like everyone to leave here with some confidence in that mission of like, you do have to prioritize, right? There's no way you're going to explicitly teach all the students, all the words that students might not be familiar with, right? And if you can prioritize with that grounding vision of like, what are going to be the words that are really going to help students understand the meaning of the text, if that is your like guiding principle, you're, you know, on the right track.
And I think just looking, and Ellie, I think maybe you spoke to this as well a little bit, but doing some like backwards mapping to like, if there's a task at the end of the lesson or you're headed somewhere for the end of the week, yeah, what are those words that students are going to be expected to know and use in production and their speaking or writing too, can help prioritize.
Okay, I will thank you guys for sharing out those reflections as a group. And so I know I felt appreciative that we were having this time together in curriculum specific groups, just because even in my group, it was like, there was some like logistical things like, where did you find that vocabulary activity, right? That it was valuable to have each other as a resource for. So thank you guys for doing that. And with that, I will hand it over to Bethany to talk about some next steps for a Strong Start Network.
All right. So in our last few minutes, we're going to talk through some next steps because there's some uniqueness to our schedule. And so I wanted to do a quick review of our calendar of events and then talk through some asynchronous activities that we're going to engage in from now until our retreat. So Jed, if you'll jump to the next slide real quick, I'll let folks see that, you know, we're here today, right, September 15th, but all of what happens between now and November 9th is going to be asynchronous, right? It kind of just fell that way on the calendar because across all of our districts, we didn't all have fall break at the same time, and we didn't want to ask anybody to try to join while they were on fall break. Need that much needed break from school. So we kind of hit in the middle with some things that we felt like would, one, be a good follow-up from today's vocabulary work, right? And then also be a prep for our retreat that we'll do in early November, which currently is still scheduled to be in person, but of course we'll keep folks in the loop about what that will look like. All right, so Jetta, back up a slide then real quick. And I just want to give you a high level overview, and then we're going to talk about each of these things. And then wink, wink, that I'll probably send a handy dandy little checklist, because you know I like a good checklist with links that will help outline all this. So don't feel like you have to capture all this in your notes or feel like you're missing links. I'll send all of that in a follow-up, okay? So kind of breaking it down between like this session and what would have been some type of session we would have had in October, and then from October to November. So you kind of see this bucketed that way here on this next step slide. So one is a vocabulary kind of follow-up to today's session. So a vocabulary instruction reflection, which we're going to do via Padlet. And then we're going to do our first student work submission. Remember that that's a wonderful way for us to kind of keep a pulse on where we are as a network. It's part of our kind of our measuring our impact. And so we'll submit some student work that we're going to collect from some vocabulary lessons that we're going to teach or leaders that you're going to observe. Then, as part of our prep for our retreat in November, we're going to revisit those empathy activities that we did last year. So our student interview and a student observation, and we're going to enter some of that information via a Google form so that we can use that information at our retreat for an empathy mapping exercise. And then I mentioned this when I sent out our August message, but we've been reading chapters 9 and 10, I believe, in our book study. So we've got just some high level kind of reflection questions for that. All right, Jetta, so let's jump ahead then to quick overview for teachers. So this is the teacher focus vocabulary reflection activity. Again, you'll implement a lesson that incorporates or that has a vocabulary instruction focus. So really about any lesson, but take a look at maybe some lessons you have upcoming and see if one maybe is a better fit than, let's say, another. You have a couple reflection questions, and what you're going to do is you're going to hop on a Padlet. And again, I'm going to send this link to you. You're going to respond to those questions based on your teaching of your lesson. And then kind of like a college course, you're going to respond to at least 2 colleagues' reflections. So we'll get a little bit of conversation happening across the network via our Padlet. And then also with that same lesson, you'll submit 5 samples of student work, and I'll send lots of directions for how to choose those samples, how to name those samples, and where to upload those samples. But it's very similar to what we did last year. And I know we have a few new members, but I'll outline all that for you in some instructions. So leaders, yours is similar. Of course, you're not teaching a lesson, right? But we're going to have you observing 3 lessons with a focus on vocabulary instruction. You're going to be thinking about those lessons through the lens of core action 2, those indicators that we looked at just a few moments ago. You have your own set of reflection questions, and then similar to teachers, you'll hop on a Padlet, respond, add your own reflections and then respond to a couple of your colleagues. And then similarly, upload some student work samples. So all of that will be related to your vocabulary work. Also, leaders, specifically for you in September, we're going to try to do a leader learning walk. And so more information will come out about this, but hold the date September 30th on your calendars. This was actually a suggestion that several of the leaders made in their leader survey. Was that, ooh, it'd be nice if leaders could do a deep dive, maybe do some learning walks together, reflect on what practices we're seeing. And we're going to do kind of a mix of an in-person / virtual learning walk. So it'll be a deep dive session for leaders. Then you'll do some walks at your school. So you won't even have to leave your building. You'll get to just hang out with your teachers, thinking about the instruction that's happening in your buildings, and also think about the goals that you have set as leaders as part of the Strong Start Network. And then we'll do some kind of wrap up collaborative reflection as well. So hold the date, more to come on those. All right, now for both teachers and leaders, in October, you'll do some empathy activities. One is a student interview around kind of those ELA instructional materials, but also around knowledge building. So you'll see a question that ties to the research that we looked at this summer. And then that same student that you interviewed, you'll try to get a snapshot of a little bit of seeing them in action, using those materials through an observation, and there's some reflection questions for that. And you'll input all that information in a Google form. And like I said a moment ago, we'll use all that information for a mapping exercise that we're going to do at our retreat. And then last but not least, our book study reflections, kind of high level reflection, triangle, square, circle. So points that stood out to you, something outside the box for you, and then a question still circling in your mind. So we're just using that protocol as a way to kick off our reflection ahead of our retreat. All right, so I know that was a lot to take in. I did it quickly because I want to try to get us out of here on time. But like I said, I'm going to send a follow-up. I'll have everything outlined for you. You'll have links to click. You won't have to go digging around anywhere for anything. But as always, if you get into it and you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. So this will take us from now all the way till November 9th when we get together for our retreat. So Jetta, with that,
Does
anything else?
Does
you
anyone
wanna
else
add?
feel like I need Bethany to just like manage my life for me in general? I could use one of those checklists for just like all.
Listen, I
Uh,
love checklists. You should see my planner. And if I don't have a check box, I make one just so I can check it. Because I love a good check box.
Well, thank you all for joining us. I know it is at the end of a long, busy day, and just so appreciate all the thoughtful conversation and collaboration. So thank you guys. And we will be seeing you soon.
Yeah. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
All right. Thank you, John, for manning our
Great.
breakout rooms. And Jetta, woohoo. Two
Woohoo.
down, one to go.
One more to go.
That's right.
All right.
All right.
Yep.
Bye, everybody.
Okay, we'll see you.
Okay.